Gosh, that lag. Just wait and wait and wait and wait. Here we go. Goodness gracious. Hopefully, like, you guys are not too tired of seeing my face already doing these short little lectures. This one's a little bit different in terms of how I want you to do it. Learning Target 1.4 is like chock full. I'll just show you on this slide here. Chock full of key concepts. So even though this is not going to be a very long presentation, I kind of think it's important for you guys to sort of pause after every slide to make sure you're jotting down the vocabulary terms, because so many of them are going to come up again and again and again. Okay, so like no pause and connect questions. You should be thinking about how these words sort of interact with one another, but ultimately you need to know the definition for all of them. So take your time through this presentation and make sure that you're not just like copying stuff down to copy it down, but that you're really understanding what I'm saying. Okay, you guys? All right, so to get started, let's talk about the spatial perspective. And we've actually already talked about this a little bit, but it's an important thing for you to start thinking about in terms of just all the things in this class. Remember that geography is focusing on the what of where, right? So what is it that we're looking at? Where is it? Why is it located there? Why should we care? And what are the patterns kind of telling us, and how are they changing over time? This is like a really cool little graphic organizer that we actually will use when we start analyzing and applying our knowledge. So you can see that step one is identifying the what and the where. Step two is looking at the pattern, so you can draw some conclusions or maybe group certain areas together. We get to regions that will make more sense. Why is it happening there, and why should we care? So what's the impact? ESPN is a tool that we use for analysis. We also use speeds. I'll probably use them interchangeably. And you don't have to worry about that tool quite yet. We'll get there. Okay, so one of the things that I like to share with students, because a lot of you are students of history, right? You've been learning about history for most of your academic careers, but when we look at geography, if we're comparing it to one of the most popular social sciences and education, historians look through the lens of time to understand the past. Geographers look through the lens of space to understand the place. So here's where things get a little tricky, right? Because you're going to see over the course of this whole school year that sometimes common words that we use in everyday language don't mean the same thing in geography, and space and place are two really good examples of that. And we're going to do a little bit more work with this during our next synchronous session. So just to give you an idea here, in geography, space is just the extent of an area, like whatever it is that you're looking at, right? It can be a small space, it can be a large space, but it doesn't really have any value. Place is when humans turn a space into something that means something to them. So we create attributes and values that we associate with a specific location, right? So like, I always like to give this example, and you guys don't know this yet, but you will. You're eventually in 3.5 years, you're going to be applying, well, two for some, 2.5 years for some of you. You're going to be applying to college, and that's going to be super exciting. And some of you are going to go away to school, and some of you are going to go really far, and some of you are not going to go that far at all. But no matter how far you go, when you come home, there's always going to be that feeling, that sense of home. Maybe your mom is cooking your favorite meal, because that's what we do when our kids come home. We want them to feel welcome, and we miss them, and so on and so forth. So there's this, even if you want to get away, when you come home, you're going to be like, Mom, I'm so happy to see you, because there's just this emotional attachment to a particular space. That's place. And place is also, and we'll talk about some more stuff in just a second. So basically, a place can be seen as a space that has meaning. And I'll show you how this works in our next class. So then when we're talking about place, which is really, we're talking about place, this is actually a really important concept in this course. So how do we describe what a location looks like? And you read a little bit about this. So I'm going to skip the first one. So you might just literally describe the things that you see, the cultural landscape, the built environment, the physical artifacts that humans create that make up the landscape. The fact that you can look at this and know that this is not in the United States and neither is this means that like there's associations that make specific places unique in some way. And so these things that we're talking about here, again, so there's the built landscape, but there's also the cultural features and the linguistic features, and all of these things go into place. Sense of place is factors that contribute to the uniqueness of a location, and we'll talk a little bit more about this as well. But essentially, a sense of place is, again, the personal meaning that you have. So the fact that a lot of students want to go to Europe, even though you haven't actually been there, means that you have a connection to it. There's like some sort of sense of place to it, a reason for you to actually want to go to it. And then placelessness is kind of what's happening here in this country. Like if you've ever taken a road trip, um, you start to like you lose the unique characteristics of a place when you see the same strip mall over and over again. So there's a convenience store and a place where you wash your clothes, laundromat, place where you wash your clothes, and like it just looks the same. There's no defining characteristics, right? This has a lot of defining characteristics. But if you were to show me two pictures of two different towns in middle America, I would have a hard time telling you like where they are because they all kind of look the same. So some other ways that we might describe place is through location. So this is how we describe where a place is located. So you read a little bit about this, and we talked a little bit about absolute and relative location. Remember, absolute and relative location, GPS coordinates. Relative is where it is in location to other places. Place name becomes really important. So we call those toponyms. We'll get more into this when we get into the culture unit, but usually a name of a place reflects the culture and history of that place in some way. And then site, which is the physical characteristics of a place. So I always say to students, when you're looking at site, and we'll talk about situation much later, but when you're looking at sites, like what do you see? How can you describe this place? So right now, the site characteristics of where I'm sitting in my backyard. I don't know if you guys can hear the locusts, but they're like super loud. There's a bunch of trees. It's like my own personal um, oasis, I guess, in this crazy coronavirus situation we're living in. And you can see some of the other characteristics that relate to site. And this was in your text, so I don't want to talk about it too much. Site characteristics also have to do with weather. So here's just a good example of where you can see some connections. And like this is not an Iceland map, but this is a regional map, a regional weather map. So it kind of shows you like regionally where we're most alike. Sort of fun when we get to, I mean, this is going to be important. We get to agriculture and culture and so on and so forth, even in this unit to a certain degree. But it's really interesting to look at the weather patterns here, like in California, mimic those weather patterns over here. And so it kind of just another way of looking at place characteristics. And so if you know the weather in California, if you know your weather here in the Midwest, then you can see where are some other places in the world that have similar weather as we do. All right, so spatial interaction. So this is where I'm anticipating that I might actually have a couple additional questions when I see you next in class. So if you do have questions or if some of this is still confusing, please don't hesitate to ask. It's hard for me to know like what's confusing and what's not. So spatial interaction is actually really important too. So how are we connected? How are things moving? What is the flow of goods between one place to another, and how does that illustrate our connections? And I'll show you a map on the next slide here. Globalization is a really important theme throughout the entire course. And just the simplest definition of globalization is the increasing interconnectedness of the world, primarily through trade, but also ideas. Globalization has made the world feel a lot smaller because there's just more ways that people are interacting with one another, primarily because of technology, communication technology, and travel technology. And of course, there are positive and negative effects to phenomenons like this, or regarding globalization. You know, sharing ideas, experiencing other cultures, sharing technologies that bring us closer together is a good thing. Globalization has led to cheaper products because we outsource. We'll talk a lot about this when we get to development, but also it leads to some culture clashes. Like this is not a McDonald's here in the United States, as you can clearly see, and that's fine for this place. I'll let you guess the place. So I'm not going to tell you, but if you ask me in, like, say, the chat the next time we see each other, we'll see. But in some places, they don't really want McDonald's. Like, there's this concept called the Americanization of the world. Like, we seem to be pushing out our culture and like minimizing other people's culture. And some would argue that's a good thing, some a bad thing. And we'll get to that conversation later. I love this map. So this is a map that illustrates the concept of flow and interconnection. I want you just to look at it because I'm like so bummed you guys aren't here in class because I love to hear what you might think this map is, but since you're not here, I'm just going to tell you. This is airline, so it's like flight patterns. So you can see a lot in this map about what's going on in terms of who's most connected and who's least connected, right? So here in the United States, you can see all the flights are going all over the place, but a lot of our flights are going to Europe, back and forth, right? And then if you look also, like a lot of these flights are going over here, probably China, most likely Japan, but it's like this northern hemisphere is just utterly connected with one another. And then you look in like, now here is the Saharan desert. So obviously we're not going to see a lot of airports there, but here in Central Africa, like there's no connection. So people here are much less connected to the rest of the world than say people who are on these flight patterns or taking these flights regularly. All right, so when we're talking about spatial interactions, there's really two ways to talk about spatial interaction. The first one that I'm going to talk about is kind of outdated because of the second one. So distance decay, and it's represented by this graph right here. It's pretty simple. It just says that the interaction between two places declines as the distance between the two places increase. So you have less interaction with things that are further away. And I would argue that distance decay is, oops, sorry about that. Let me go back. That distance decay is probably really relevant for people here. Maybe less relevant for people here because you're not actually that separated. That's going to be important when I talk about the other way to talk about spatial interaction, right? So distance decay for areas that are less connected, the concept is still pretty relevant, right? Some things that might lead to distance decay are things like mountains, rivers, oceans, deserts, cultural barriers as well, like linguistic barriers. So if you can't speak the language, then you don't have a lot of interaction with people that speak a different language than you. Now, the reason why this is outdated is because of this concept, which is time-space compression. So as the world becomes more connected through globalization and information technology and improved travel, like really fast planes and trains, it doesn't seem like the world is as disconnected as it once was, right? So I love this graph to explain it. So between 1500 and 1850, when the fastest mode of transportation was a boat, and we're talking months of travel between, say, Europe and the United States, the world felt very far apart and distance decay was very relevant, right? Then you move into improved technology and the world becomes a little bit like it shrinks down a little bit. So now we're talking about faster modes of transportation like trains. And again, still not the fastest mode. Now we get to 1950s and aircrafts, and now we've got these like passenger jets that are like super, super fast. So that's why distance decay is a little bit less relevant, particularly for those areas that are less connected on that flow map with airlines. So that is about it. So let me just, for content, so let me just show you an example of how we might, chit-chatting, show you an example of how we might actually see this in a couple of maps. So what is, where, patterns, why, there, etc. So if you're looking at this population density map of China, you can see that the vast majority of the population is along the coast. And there's some reasons for that that we'll talk about later in both our migration unit and our culture unit and our development unit. So we're going to come back to this map of China. Now, the more populated an area is in terms of its density, the more unhealthy it is in terms of air pollution. So there's some correlation between the most populated areas, and you're seeing like these little dots right here. So we've got a graduated symbol map, and then we've also got an isoline map, so a combination of different maps here. You can see that the most populated areas are right here and then a little bit right here. And you can look at like in terms of the pollution, air pollution, where it's the least healthy and there's a great deal of overlap of population. Cool, right? So now we just identified the what, the where, and the patterns. But then what's interesting is if you take a look at what happened as a result of the quarantine of the coronavirus. So again, Same map as before, only a different view of the pollution issues in China. So, one of the benefits of what happened because of quarantine was this is the new map of pollution. People stopped moving, driving the cars, businesses shut down. So, the air really improved in areas where air pollution was a big problem. So, why should we care? Well, I think it's pretty self explanatory, right? It's an interesting way to look at how things actually change as a result of something else happening. So that's it for this presentation. And again, lots and lots of vocabulary there. Try to find some opportunities for application, but we're going to be working with these terms on Thursday, Friday. Always with the lag.